The sun beat down mercilessly as Tom Neal crouched in the sand, planting sprouting coconuts on a tiny island speck in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Then, without warning, agony struck. A searing bolt of pain shot through his back, paralyzing his legs. He collapsed, his body trembling uncontrollably, his muscles convulsing in relentless spasms. 3 miles away from the safety of his shack on the neighboring Suvarov Atoll, Neal was utterly alone. Crawling 10 yards to his boat left him gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, as despair clawed at his mind. This wasn't just a struggle, it was a race against time. On today's episode of The Infographic Show, we'll explore the incredible story of Thomas Francis Neal and his dream of isolation on a deserted island. Tom Neal wouldn't claim his island paradise until his later years, well into his 50s and 60s. A drifter, a dreamer, and an unapologetic individualist, he found solace in solitude, retreating to Suvarov to live life on his terms. I choose to live in the Pacific Islands because life there moves at the sort of pace which you feel God must have had in mind originally when he made the sun to keep us warm and provided the fruits of the earth for the taking. Later described as a wiry, leather-skinned leprechaun, Neal cut a striking figure. Clad in little more than a strip of cloth and a wide-brimmed woven hat, shielding his balding pate and jug-handle ears, he was among the last of his kind. He was a man who answered only to himself and nature. He would eventually spend nearly half a decade in blissful isolation, but the journey to his island Eden was anything but easy. Life threw its share of obstacles at Neal, testing his grit and unshakable resolve long before he ever set foot on his deserted sanctuary. Tom Neal's family had no wanderlust. They were practical people tied to the land and their unchanging routines. But Tom was different. Born in New Zealand in 1902, he felt the pull of the ocean from an early age. He had an insatiable longing for open horizons and distant shores. At 18, he joined the Royal New Zealand Navy as an apprentice engineer. For 4 years, he sailed the Pacific, fixing engines in the bowels of naval vessels and catching tantalizing glimpses of the ports they passed. But Tom was no cog in the machine. The routine stifled him. The Navy's discipline and regimentation chafed against his independent spirit. In 1922, he bought himself out of his contract despite the cost, a bold move for a young man with little to his name. He wanted more than fleeting glimpses of the Pacific's magic. He wanted to live it himself. Neal became a true vagabond of the sea. From 1922 to 1928, he wandered from island to island, taking odd jobs wherever he landed, sweeping stone floors, hauling supplies, and mending boats. The work was never glamorous, but it sustained him and kept him close to the water. Each island brought new faces, new stories, and new secrets whispered across the waves. By the time he returned home at the age of 28, his family barely recognized him. His sun-leathered skin and sea-hardened demeanor spoke of a life lived far beyond New Zealand's quiet borders. He didn't stay for long. Home felt foreign, as if the land itself rejected his restless soul. Soon he left again, vanishing back into the Pacific. Over the next 15 years, Neal led a transient life, flitting between islands and odd jobs, clearing brush, planting bananas, and storekeeping. He spent a stint in French Tahiti, where he lived a meager life, spoiling himself only with the occasional book. The Second World War brought him to the Rarotonga in the Cook Islands, his first encounter with the cluster of isles that would come to define his legacy. There, amidst the haze of war, a friend spoke of a place that captured Neal's imagination like no other: Suvarov Atoll. A tiny island with a shimmering lagoon encircled by a coral reef, Suvarov was a Pacific jewel, the epitome of isolation, 50 miles in circumference, a few hundred feet wide, and 1 mile long. Its reef vanished beneath the tides, leaving a spate of fragile islets bunched together around the central island. The nearest human habitation was 213 miles away on Manihiki. In 1945, while working with a group of coast watchers, Neal finally set eyes on Suvarov when their ship anchored off its shore. The vision seared itself into his memory. Standing on the deck of the ship, Neal made a vow. He would return to Suvarov not as a visitor, but as an inhabitant. The promise wasn't easy to keep. By then, Neal was already well into his 40s, and Suvarov wasn't a stop on regular shipping routes. For 7 long years, Neal waited for a vessel departing Rarotonga that would pass close enough to drop him off. 7 years of restless jobs and restless dreaming. Finally, in 1952, his moment arrived. A ship bound for Suvarov would take him. With just 79 pounds to his name, Neal abandoned his job and his friends on Rarotonga, packed his belongings, said his farewells, and boarded the vessel that would carry him to the solitary island he had coveted for so long. It had taken decades of wandering, toil, and quiet yearning, but it took 3 minutes to make the final decision. Tom Neal was about to live the life he had always imagined, entirely unequivocally alone. What would you take if you had just 2 weeks to prepare for an indefinite stay on a deserted island? Think carefully, your survival might depend on it. For Tom Neal, the answer came in a whirlwind of packing and planning. When he was told he could catch a rare ship to Sevvarov, he had only 14 days to gather everything he thought he needed. Dropped off on October 7, 1952, Neal stepped onto the island with 2 cats and 21 packages of supplies. Some items were obvious: a sack of Australian flour, cooking wares, a 70-pound bag of sugar, coffee beans, tins of bully beef, butter, and seasonings. But his focus went beyond food. Neal was more afraid of toothaches and other small maladies than major illnesses. Razor blades, toothpaste, and sewing supplies made the list, along with clothes, 6 pairs of rubber-soled tennis shoes, a mattress, sheets, pillows, and towels. He also carried tools: a bamboo pole, saplings, a broom, and long-handled implements for clearing and planting. And with that, Neal was alone. For the next 2 years, Sevvarov would be his entire world. The day Tom Neal set foot on Sevvarov Atoll was a study in contrasts. The lagoon stretched before him impossibly calm, its glassy surface reflecting a cloudless sky. The tropical sun bore down with unrelenting heat, and the white sandy beach glared so brightly it hurt his eyes. As the ship that had brought him retreated to the horizon, a pang of loneliness struck him. For the first time, Neal felt the weight of his decision. This was no romantic adventure or brief escape. It was absolute isolation. The reality of his new home hit him almost immediately. He had inherited an old Coast Watcher's hut nestled in a grove of palms just off the beach. It was, in a word, chaos. The roof was rotten, letting in rain that had turned the inside into a damp, forlorn mess. A battered boat lay overturned nearby, its hull cracked and devoid of caulking. Without a way to repair it, the boat was little more than a useless relic. Around the hut, years of neglect were on full display. A family of wild pigs roamed the island freely, trampling through the remains of a garden. Chickens darted in and out of the overgrowth, and vines choked every corner of what had once been a cultivated land. A single breadfruit tree hinted at fertile soil, but its fruits were sparse. Despite this, there were some small mercies. The bedroom contained an actual bed, a surprising luxury, along with a sturdy table and a few furnishings. There was a bathhouse and a shed, though both were in rough shape. And most critically, there was plenty of work to keep him occupied. In his journal that evening, Neal wrote, "Haven't had time for a proper look around, but I can see miles of work sticking out. There will be no time for sitting under a tree and watching the reef, not for a long time anyway." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Neal picked up one of the 50 paperback books he brought with him, The Island of Desire, and read until he fell asleep. The irony of that title was not lost on him. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the squeals of wild pigs that seemed to mock his solitude. When the ship disappeared the next day, Neal waved goodbye, removing his shorts and swinging them as a final farewell to civilization. From then on, he adopted a loincloth fashioned from an old Pariu. The gesture was symbolic. He had severed his last contract with the outside world. Neal spent his initial days surveying his domain. He explored the island, noting its high points and assessing the scope of the work ahead. He discovered pawpaw trees and coconut crabs, but found no bees, insects, or reptiles to disrupt his plans. The pigs, however, posed a problem. Left unchecked, they would destroy his fruit trees and make cultivation nearly impossible. Routine became his anchor. Each day before dawn, awakened by the crow of a rooster, he'd lie in bed for a few relaxed moments before filling his cast-iron kettle and lighting a fire. A quick wash followed, then breakfast. The cats, his constant companions, were fed fish that he caught the day before. Then it was time for work. He cleared the brush, planted new crops, fished, unpacked supplies, scrubbed his hut, and even plated a roof to replace the hut's rotting one. He worked through lunch, chewing coconuts as he toiled. In the evenings, he would fish, cook his meal, and then carry a bowl of tea to the beach. Sitting on a makeshift box chair, he'd watch the sun sink into the Pacific, marveling at the colors as they bled across the sky. Neal took pride in reviving the remnants of the Coast Watchers camp. He rebuilt the garden using compost to enrich the soil and planted banana suckers in hopes of growing his own fruit. The bathhouse and shed were patched up, and the shack was fortified to withstand the inevitable Pacific squalls. He made plans to tame the wild fowl for their eggs and to cull the pigs that threatened his crops. He also established a meticulous system for cleanliness, boiling his bed linens once a month and shaving twice weekly. Evenings were often spent reading. One night, he devoured Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, a frightful vision of modernity that made him grateful for his isolation. Here on Sevvarov, he felt he had made the right choice. He had escaped the mechanized, oppressive future Huxley described, trading it for a simpler existence. Within weeks, Neil had slipped into a rhythm that would define his time on the island. His days blended hard labor, simple pleasures, and quiet reflection. Though the work was grueling, it was also fulfilling. Each improvement to the island was a testament to his self-reliance, each sunset a reminder of the life he had chosen. For Neil, solitude wasn't a burden, it was liberation. On Suvarov, he wasn't a wanderer or a laborer, he was the master of his own world. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. The new year brought 2 relentless weeks of rain, a deluge that pounded Suvarov and left Tom Neil stranded in his hut, pondering the work ahead. As he gazed out at the torrential squall, one task loomed larger in his mind than all the rest. The pigs, 5 monstrous boars, were tearing through his garden, his lifeline on the island. It was clear either they went or he did. Neil approached the problem with grim determination. He wasn't a hunter by nature, and the idea of killing the pigs filled him with dread. But there was no choice. He set to work fashioning a weapon, repairing a broken machete blade and lashing it to a sturdy pole. The result was a makeshift spear, razor sharp and ready for action. Next, he built a platform 12 feet high in a palm tree overlooking a clearing. To lure in his adversaries, he scattered coconuts below and then climbed into his perch and waited. Night after night, the vigil dragged on. Coconut crabs scuttled through the clearing, rats darted in and out, but there was no sign of the pigs. By the 5th night, Neil was beginning to doubt his plan when he finally heard the unmistakable sound of a boar snuffling through the undergrowth. His heart raced as adrenaline surged through his veins. The boar approached, its tusks glinting faintly in the moonlight. Neil gripped his spear tightly, muscles tensed. The beast paused beneath him, sniffing the air suspiciously, as if sensing it wasn't alone. Then, with a surge of courage, Neil drove the spear downward with all his strength, striking the boar's neck. The animal let out an ear-splitting squeal and thrashed violently, wrenching the spear from Neil's hands and bolting into the thicket. Neil scrambled down from the tree and gave chase, desperate not to lose sight of it. He caught up with the wounded boar in a nearby thicket, slashing its spine with a machete in a frantic flurry. The boar collapsed, screaming horribly, and Neil finished the job with a swift cut to its throat. As he returned to his home, he decided to bury the animal the next day, noting in his journal that nothing on earth could have induced me to eat the creature. The grim work wasn't over. Over the next several months, he repeated this horrifying process 4 more times, waiting for moonlit nights to take down each boar. By late spring, the pigs were gone, and the island began to transform. Pawpaw roots shot up where they had once been trampled, wild bananas took seed, and his garden flourished. Suvarov provided for him in abundance, and his cookhouse became so well-stocked he became ever more reluctant to dip into his original supplies. With the pigs gone, Neil turned his attention to a new project, a boat. The battered old tub he'd inherited from the Coast Watchers seemed a lost cause, with its cracked hull and years of neglect. But Neil wasn't deterred. Using homemade caulk, he patched the leaks and christened the craft the Ruptured Duckling, in memory of an old friend Dakiti whose canoe had borne the same name. The duckling proved invaluable, allowing him to gather fertile soil from the far ends of the atoll. Trips that would have taken days on foot were now completed in hours. The boat also opened new horizons, enabling him to row to nearby islets. Yet, as he'd soon discover, venturing beyond the safety of his home brought its own set of dangers. Life on Suvarov Atoll had its moments of tranquil beauty, but it was not without peril. For Tom Neil, the first major danger struck suddenly and without warning, as would many of the challenges that followed. It began with a careless scratch from a piece of coral on his foot, a minor injury that turned into a life-threatening ordeal. Within days, the wound swelled, inflamed and angry, and he was struck down by fever. The infection sapped his strength, leaving him delirious and drenched in sweat. His temperature soared. I unwillingly hovered between moments when my brain was clear, he later wrote, and that other semi-delirious dream world, which always seemed to be reaching for me. Even as he lay shaking and weak, the island demanded attention. His cats needed to be fed, and the most urgent tasks couldn't be ignored. It took him a week to recover fully, but the lesson was clear. The smallest misstep could lead to disaster. Neil was dismayed to find that his garden had suffered in his absence. Many of his plants had failed to set fruit, and what little had grown had been devoured by an army of tiny hermit crabs. He hadn't even noticed the culprits until he caught them in the act, and it was a bitter blow, but Neil didn't despair. Instead, he painstakingly caught and relocated the crabs to the far side of the island, clearing the way for his crops to flourish. Without bees to pollinate his plants, Neil had to take matters into his own hands, literally. He learned to pollinate the blossoms by hand, breaking off male flowers and rubbing them against the female ones. It was slow, meticulous work, but it paid off. Soon his crops began to thrive, and the garden was once again a source of pride and sustenance. Then on August 4, 1953, 10 months after he first arrived, a schooner appeared on the lagoon. Neil's heart leapt as 4 visitors, 2 wealthy couples, disembarked. They had heard of him from the British consul in Tahiti, who had joked about checking if Neil had kicked what remains of the island into the sea with those big boots of his. For Neil, the visit was a whirlwind of excitement. He showed the guests around the island, proudly displaying his tidy hut and resourceful setup. He treated them to the novelty of bathing in the lagoon and fishing with spears. But it was Neil who was truly spoiled. For the first time in months, he enjoyed the luxuries of ice-cold beer, rum, and cigarettes. That night aboard the schooner, Neil dined like a king. The meal, a thick vegetable soup, meat, roast potatoes swimming in rich gravy, and freshly baked bread slathered with butter, was a feast unlike any he could have dreamed of on Suvarov. When the schooner departed, leaving Neil to his solitude once more, he turned his attention to his next great challenge, repairing the ancient pier that was little more than an eyesore. Every day for 3 hours at a stretch, he hauled coral blocks from the beach to the water's edge at high tide. The work was grueling, and it added to his already packed schedule of tending the garden, feeding his fowl and ducks, fishing, and managing his tools and food stores. He was so consumed by the daily grind he failed to notice a troubling decline in his own health. His diet, lacking sufficient meat, left him drained of energy. Then, without warning, he was struck down by another fever. This time, the sickness came with chills, hot flashes, and weakness so profound his legs refused to carry him. For 4 agonizing days, he lay on his bed, soaked in sweat, his head burning with pain and swelling. He drifted between moments of lucidity and feverish dreams, unable to do more than manage the barest necessities. When the fever finally broke, it was another week before he could stand and resume his work. Neil knew then that the island, while beautiful and bountiful, would never be an easy place to live. Each day was a test of his resilience, and every challenge, no matter how small, was a reminder of the precarious balance between survival and failure. This time, however, it would only get worse for Neil. Having spent 6 months laboring to rebuild the ancient pier, he finally completed it. Day by day, he hauled heavy coral stones, his hands blistered and raw, carefully stacking them until the structure stood strong and proud. For the first time, he felt a sense of permanence on the atoll, a symbol of his resilience and determination. But Suvarov's cruelties knew no bounds. Barely 24 hours after the pier was finished, the sky darkened, and a once-in-a-decade storm descended. Gigantic seas smashed into the shore, a roiling mass of water whipped by winds of unimaginable force. Coconut palms, their roots grasping at shifting sands, toppled like matchsticks. The beach vanished under a frothing blanket of white foam, and Neil clung desperately to the sturdiest trees he could find as the wind shrieked. The tin roof of his shanty vibrated like a buzzsaw, and the veranda was torn away entirely when a falling tree struck it. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving Neil in a daze of exhaustion and disbelief. Stumbling onto the beach, he froze at the sight before him. The pier was gone. The massive blocks, painstakingly laid over half a year, had been torn apart by the storm's fury and hurled back toward the beach. They now lie in chaotic disarray, a cruel mockery of his labor. Neil could only stand there, staring at the ruins of his work, feeling an overwhelming sense of futility. 3 months passed as Neil focused on clearing the debris left by the storm. He abandoned any thought of rebuilding the pier. The island demanded too much, and the toll on his body and spirit was growing. Then, on Saturday, May 22, 1954, Neil's sojourn delivered its most dangerous blow yet. The morning broke to a perfect sunrise. Neil planned to take his boat to a neighboring islet, fittingly named One Tree, to plant sprouting coconuts. But as he began his work on the island, a searing pain shot up his spine, doubling him over in agony. He froze, trembling and locked in place, his back seemingly dislocated, his legs unable to move. 3 miles separated him from the safety of his shanty, and each movement was sheer torment. Gritting his teeth, Neil crawled to his boat, sweat pouring from his body with every agonizing effort. The thought of dying alone on the island loomed large in his mind. How would he feed himself if he couldn't even stand? How could he survive? In what he would later describe as sheer desperation, Neil hoisted himself into the boat. With the help of his sail, he drifted back toward Suvarov, every minute a battle to remain upright and still, avoiding any movement that might worsen his condition. For 4 agonizing hours, he made short, shallow strokes to keep his boat on course, finally reaching the shore. When a wave carried the boat aground, Neil tied it to the nearest palm tree and crawled back to his hut. The next days passed in a haze of pain and helplessness. Ships rarely visited Suvarov, and the possibility of rescue seemed too remote to even consider. He prepared himself for the worst. Then, lying flat on his back 4 days later, Neil thought he heard voices. At first, he dismissed them as a fever dream, but the voices grew clearer, louder. 2 men had arrived, startled to find a starving and delirious white man in a loincloth instead of an uninhabited island. One of them, an American, quickly assessed Neil's condition and offered to help. With a swift, excruciating maneuver, the man manipulated Neil's back, popping it into place. The pain was unbearable but necessary. Neil was fed, given rum and cigarettes, and slowly began to regain his strength. The men explained they had come from Tahiti, heading to Samoa, and decided on a whim to stop at Sevastopol to search for rumored treasure. They never expected to find a man clinging to life. Despite their pleas for him to leave with them, Neil hesitated. Sevastopol was more than an island to him, it was a way of life. But his body had reached its limit. His back, weakened by arthritis rather than a slipped disc, made survival impossible. The Cook Islands government sent a ship to evacuate him 2 weeks later. As the crowded steamer pulled away from Sevastopol, Neil stood on the deck watching the atoll fade into the distance. The melancholy of leaving was almost too much to bear. For 21 months he had lived a life many had dreamed of, but the island had demanded a price he could no longer pay. It would be 6 years before he returned. Tom Neil's dream of returning to his beloved island seemed to fade with each passing year in civilization. His time on Rarotonga, 500 miles away, had been a stark contrast to his first stint on Sevastopol. Working as a storeman for a modest 25 pounds a month, Neil managed to live comfortably but felt unfulfilled. It wasn't until his mother's unexpected passing left him a 240-pound inheritance that the possibility of returning became real. The chance encounter with a generous American traveler passing through Rarotonga provided the opportunity. The traveler offered Neil passage to Sevastopol, and at nearly 60 years old, Neil seized the chance. This time he was better prepared. His improved finances allowed him to stock up on supplies, 3 times the amount of bully beef, tea, cigarettes, and powdered milk compared to his first expedition. Armed with better tools, a sturdier boat, and the wisdom that comes with experience, he set sail for the island he longed for. The journey back to Sevastopol spanned 11 arduous days, fraught with relentless hazards. When Neil finally arrived, he was relieved to find the atoll much as he had left it. But nature had taken its toll. His shack still stood, though it bore the scars of ferocious storms. Roofs were torn, debris littered the ground, and his once organized office was now a shallow, storm-battered lake. The fruit trees had vanished, and the island bore the scars of time and neglect. Yet Neil's spirits were high. He had the means and the resolve to restore his home. For the next 3.5 years, Neil rebuilt his life on Sevastopol. He approached the work more leisurely than before, learning to balance his labor with moments of rest, avoiding the overwork that had plagued his first stint. He put his house in order, revived the systems of survival he had previously established, and even cleared weeks' worth of storm debris from the shore. His routine slipped into a slower tempo, with periodic excursions to neighboring lagoons and islets. On one of these, he constructed a summer residence on Mototuo, rowing over whenever the mood struck him. Life on the atoll was solitary, though not entirely devoid of human contact. Over the years, 6 yachts visited, including one that sparked a 14-month stretch of total isolation between visits. Yet Neil claimed he was never lonely. One unexpected encounter occurred when the thrum of helicopter blades shattered the island's stillness. 2 U.S. Navy helicopters, part of an icebreaker crew en route to Antarctica, landed on Sevastopol. The officers, astonished to find Neil living there voluntarily, offered to rescue him. Clad in his Pariu loincloth, his sun-darkened skin and island demeanor initially made them think he was a native. "Robinson Crusoe come true," one officer exclaimed. Their visit lasted just half an hour, but it left an impression, ultimately leading to a press release which brought author Noel Barber to Neil's door. Barber stayed for 2 days, delivering supplies and capturing the essence of Neil's life on film before departing. Despite his isolation, Neil still faced grave dangers. On one harrowing occasion, he was caught in a massive Pacific squall while navigating the lagoon. His boat capsized, leaving him in the water for 5 grueling hours. Waves pounded the coral reef, and Neil struggled to right his mast, diving repeatedly into the turbulent water. Finally, after countless attempts, he succeeded, hanging onto the mast as the storm subsided. Exhausted, with the skin on his left arm rubbed raw from bailing water, he rowed back to the shore at dusk, too tired to do more than collapse. Life on the island carried on, punctuated by a mix of tranquility and surprise. Months passed without visitors until a random encounter brought 3 castaways to his doorstep. Ed Vesey, an American yachtsman, had been traveling with his Samoan wife and daughter when their yacht Tiburon struck a coral head and sank. The family barely escaped with their lives, arriving on Suvarov with nothing but a guitar. Neil, accustomed to his solitude, struggled with the intrusion. The family crowded into his tiny shack, sharing his limited provisions. Yet together they salvaged what they could from the wreck of the Tiburon. Over 2 weeks they retrieved essentials like clothing, bedding, tinned food, and even Ed's false teeth. Their stay ended months later when a passing New Zealand frigate, alerted by mirror signals, arrived to rescue them. Secretly wishing the castaways could stay longer, Neil returned to his quiet existence. The rhythm of life on Suvarov continued, and though the island tested him repeatedly, it also gave him purpose and peace, a rare balance that only a man like Tom Neil could embrace. 2 months after the castaways' departure, Tom Neil, now in his 70s, realized the prospect of a lonely death on Suvarov was no longer appealing. When a group of pearl divers arrived, disturbing the peace of his paradise, he returned to Rarotonga. As a storekeeper, he lived out his final years surrounded by memories only he could treasure. Neil passed away in 1977, frail and shriveled from cancer in a Rarotonga hospital. While many dream of a life untouched by society, Neil actually lived it, a rare figure whose story remains a fascinating testament to self-sufficiency and resilience. What do you think about Tom Neil's extraordinary life of isolation? Could you imagine yourself thriving alone on a deserted island? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out I Was Trapped Underwater for 3 Days, or click on this video instead.